In the heart of the celestial arena orbiting the twin suns of Vulcarus, the galaxy's most powerful beings gathered under silver banners fluttering in artificial gravity to witness a battle unlike any other. A trial not only of strength, but of pride, legacy, and the unshakable codes of two very different civilizations. The Zilari, known across the stars for their towering forms and unmatched combat traditions, had sent their greatest warrior to uphold their honor. The warrior princess, daughter of their ruling queen, trained from childhood in the arts of war. Born with armor in her blood and fire in her veins, she stood still as a statue in the center of the ring, her gaze sharp and steady, while thousands of alien eyes watched from above. Across from her stood the human, a figure much smaller, less intimidating in appearance, but standing with a quiet, unshaken calm. Captain Rain of Earth's Terran Defense Corps had no ceremonial armor, no ancestral blade, no telepathic guidance from spirit ancestors. He wore only the light, flexible suit designed for mobility and life support. His eyes not fierce like the warrior's, but focused like a surgeon's hand before the first cut. No trace of fear or excitement lingered in his face, just stillness, like a man about to solve a puzzle rather than fight for his life. Voice of the Arbiter filled the arena, not through speakers, but directly into every listener's mind, translated perfectly into the languages of all species present. The terms were repeated for all to hear and accept. This would be a duel of honor, without weapons, without interference, and without second chances. The one who fell would be declared the lesser, and the consequences would be absolute according to the ancient code that ruled over the Zilari for generations. At the signal, the warrior princess launched forward with a speed that blurred her form in midair, her motion precise and brutal as her arm extended to strike what she assumed would be an easily broken opponent. The crowd leaned forward, breathless with certainty of her swift victory. But what followed was not a scream, nor a crunch of shattered bone. Instead, the princess found herself flipped midair by a perfectly timed redirection of momentum. Rain had not blocked nor countered, but had moved in a way that made her strength work against her. She hit the ground with a soundless thud, more of disbelief than pain echoing through her chest. Scrambling upright, she attacked again with a fury that made the air tremble. Strikes rained like thunderbolts, each meant to end the match, but each deflected, avoided, or absorbed by movements that seemed too simple to be effective. And yet, again and again, he stayed upright while she grew breathless. Time passed in strange, slow waves while the two circled and clashed. Yet it became clear to those watching that the human was not trying to hurt her. He was simply staying one step ahead, never striking first, never provoking, only reacting, always with precision and thoughtfulness. His strategy was not to dominate, but to survive, and in surviving, he was winning. Her frustration grew, and with it her form began to waver, her breath turned ragged, and her steps heavy. Then with one final move, Rain shifted his body just as she lunged, catching her center of mass and bringing her down in a motion so fluid and final that it seemed more like a dance than a fight. She landed flat on her back, her limbs pinned gently but firmly as silence fell across the arena. No pain, no blood, only stillness and the weight of undeniable defeat. The Arbiter's voice returned flat and final as it echoed across the minds of the thousands present. The match had ended with the human victorious. The warrior princess had failed in her duty, and by the code of her people, such failure demanded repayment through sacred ritual. It was not merely a loss of battle, but a shaming of royal blood, and by law the responsibility now shifted upward. The queen herself, bound by tradition, would now have to present herself before the victor and either restore the family's honor through her own submission or lose the throne. She held the crowd erupted not in cheers, but in disbelief, confusion, and outrage. Zilari voices thundered in rage while ambassadors from other races whispered among themselves. This was no ordinary duel. This was a collapse of expectations, a shift in power, the kind that history books would record not in numbers, but in tremors of political and cultural weight. Captain Rain stood, slowly backing away from the fallen princes and offering a hand which she stared at, but did not take. He did not smile or celebrate. Instead, he simply looked around as if trying to understand the storm his actions had created. He had not come for conquest or ceremony, only because he had been challenged and he had answered with the best of what he had. Not power but understanding, not speed but timing, not dominance but balance in. The royal chambers of the Zilari Palace, orbiting the ice moon Kellyan the Queen, received the news with a silence so heavy it felt like gravity itself. Her advisors waited for her fury, but none came. Only a long breath as she stood and walked to the ceremonial mirror where past queens had prepared for wars and victories and funerals. She stared at her own reflection, a face carved by duty and time and wisdom. Then she whispered a single sentence. To herself, not of anger, but acceptance. Now it is my turn, and far across the stars, as the human ship docked at the outer gates of the Zilari capital, the entire galaxy held its breath, not knowing what would follow, but sensing that something ancient had cracked, and in that fracture, something new was about to rise, because one human had won a battle. But what came next might be a war of hearts, empires, and everything in between. Great halls of the Zilari royal palace shimmered under the glow of soft azure light that came from the twin crystals mounted high along the ceiling. The walls were carved from stone mined deep, beneath the glaciers of Kellyan, cold to the touch yet alive with energy that pulsed gently through the veins of the palace like the breath of something ancient and proud. Inside the throne chamber, Queen stood tall with her head held high and her eyes fixed on the far doors that would soon open to admit the human she had never met him before, never spoken to him, and yet his presence now rippled through her life and her legacy, as if he had been written into the fabric of her destiny from the start. Her shoulders carried the weight of thousands of years of tradition, and now that same tradition demanded she stand before the one who had defeated her blood and fulfill the right she had ruled with reason, strength, and silence, never once bending to outside pressure. And now the universe watched to see if she would kneel not in defeat but in accordance with her own law. The doors parted with a soft hiss, and the human stepped into the chamber alone, without guards, without weapons, and without hesitation. His movements were calm, his eyes alert but not aggressive, and his uniform simple. His posture did not challenge hers, yet it also did not yield. It was as if he stood not as a conqueror, but as a guest, curious and watchful, ready to listen. The Queen took her seat on the wide circular throne, carved with the faces of rulers long gone. She motioned with one hand, and a quiet vibration passed through the floor. As the chamber sealed itself for privacy, none would hear what was said within these walls. Her voice echoed with the control of one who knew the value of silence more than speech. She asked why he had chosen to accept the challenge from her daughter, knowing full well the risk and the weight it carried. Rain answered without raising his voice, explaining that he had not come seeking glory or insult. He had accepted because to refuse would have been a dishonor to the one who offered the challenge, and because he believed that sometimes courage was not in the winning, but in the stepping forward. The Queen listened without interruption, her mind analyzing his every word, his tone, his expressions, but she found no mockery, no pride, only sincerity that puzzled her, for she had met many warriors across the stars, and most wore their victories like crowns, yet this human wore his like a quiet badge, something earned, not flaunted. She stood then, moving slowly around him, as she spoke of the ancient rites, the consequences, the obligation that now rested upon her shoulders. She told him that while her daughter's defeat was public and absolute, the law required something personal and binding from her, the ruler, and thus she was required to offer her hand in union, not as a gift, but as payment. Rain did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze upward toward the hovering lights that marked the lineage of the throne. He asked softly what the union meant to her people. Was it a ceremony of control, of equality, or of symbolism? Her steps slowed as she considered the question for the first time, not as law, but as something human. He was not asking about rules, but about meaning, and that unsettled her, for she had lived her life by codes, not feelings yet. Now she had to find words for what had never needed explaining. She told him that the union was a binding of roles, not emotions adjoining that serve the needs of the people, not the wants of the heart. It was built to maintain balance and face consequence, but never meant to foster affection. It was law and duty, and his story reigned nodded not in agreement, but in understanding. He said he would not force a vow where there was no choice, but he would accept her challenge. Instead, not of combat, but of coexistence, he proposed a single condition: if he could survive within her world for 7 days, without submitting, without causing division, and without bending to hatred, then she would allow the union, not because law demanded it, but because she saw something worthy in its potential. The queen hesitated for the first time in many cycles of the moon. The silence stretched between them, but she finally agreed, not because she believed he would succeed, but because part of her wanted to see what he would do. Under pressure, not of fists but of minds, hearts, and eyes that watched from shadows. Thus, the agreement was made, and the next morning he began his stay inside the core of the palace, surrounded by those who did not trust him, servants who watched with suspicion, guards who viewed him as a threat, nobles who whispered and plotted in dark corners. The princess watched from afar too, her face unreadable but her mind restless each time she saw him walking calmly through the courtyard, speaking gently with the botanists, asking questions about the crystal gardens, helping a worker lift a fallen crate, not out of show but simple instinct. Never raised his voice, never tried to claim space that was not his. He observed, he listened, and when confronted, he responded with calm words that reflected not fear but restraint and strength of another kind. Every moment became a test, each interaction a new way for the court to try and provoke or confuse him. They changed the customs daily, offered him food with hidden meanings, invited him to rituals meant to shame or unnerve. And through it all he kept moving, kept breathing, and never allowed himself to become what they hoped to see: a beast pretending to be civil. And somewhere behind the cold mask of rulership, the queen began to feel a disturbance, not in her palace, but in herself. The first time she wondered if strength alone was not enough, if perhaps control without understanding was the very thing that made empires rot from within. She watched the human walk through her palace, not like a conqueror, but like a mirror reflecting back at her a truth she had long buried. 7 days had only just begun, and already the ground beneath her tradition was shifting, and though she would never admit it, not yet, at least a quiet part of her wanted to know how far this human would go before he stumbled, or perhaps if he would fall at all. The palace became a living maze for the human, a place not of comfort or rest, but of unspoken challenges and constant eyes watching from every shadow. Each corridor he walked held its own history, carved in walls that remembered every ruler, every war, every betrayal, and still Rain moved forward with the same quiet strength that had shocked the arena, not with weapons or arrogance, but with steady steps and a mind that refused to bend. Queen had not spoken to him again since their first meeting. Her attention turned elsewhere, or so it seemed, yet her presence never truly vanished. From around him, her voice echoed through her people. Her authority lingered in every order passed down by her attendants, and her thoughts reached him through the cold way. The palace changed its rhythm whenever he approached spaces once silent, now filled with whispers, eyes once indifferent, now burning with questions. The first day passed with silence and observation. Rain did not speak unless spoken to, and he never asked for more than what was offered. He explored the palace gardens where giant flora bloomed under artificial suns, their colors glowing with unnatural brilliance. He paused to examine the strange life around him, not with a soldier's mind, but with a curiosity that belonged to someone who still believed every world had something to teach. Servants watched him move through the garden, expecting him to touch what was forbidden or disturb the sacred soil, but he only walked with hands behind his back, his eyes lifting to the golden vines that stretched like veins into the upper domes. And the caretakers who had once prepared insults in secret now found themselves speaking answers to the questions he asked: about soil temperatures, about crystal-fed roots, about the music played to encourage growth. On the second day, Rain joined a meal among the lower attendants, a silent act that defied custom. The Queen's own table remained empty for him by design, and the nobles dined. Separately in halls filled with golden light and cold stares, yet Rain sat cross-legged. On the floor with workers who looked at him first with confusion, then amusement, and finally with something close to acceptance as he shared the strange round fruits. He had brought from his ship fruits that changed color when peeled and tasted. Like spiced light, he asked them about their lives, their homes, their families, and though they hesitated at first, the simplicity of his presence loosened their words, and they spoke of the great wind tunnels of the southern moons, of the glowing fish that flew through the fogs of the eastern lakes, of how their children learned to speak in patterns of light before they ever used sound. By the third day the tension had grown sharper, not because of anything Rain had done, but because of what he had not done. He had not challenged anyone, not resisted the strange rules, not broken protocol, and in that refusal to react with aggression, the nobles began to worry, for something they did not understand was harder to destroy than something predictable. They had hoped for a beast, but instead found a mirror that showed them a reflection without flaws. In the main courtyard where warriors trained, he watched silently from the side, his arms crossed as two young fighters clashed under the heat of red suns, their movements sharp and full of fire. But when one slipped and fell, the other hesitated, and Rain stepped forward only then to lift the fallen one to his feet with a nod, not of pity, but of respect. The watching warriors frowned, unsure whether to hate him or salute. The princess observed all from behind the shields of her silence, her pride bruised, yet her thoughts restless, as she tried to understand why the one who had defeated her did not claim victory like others. Would she remembered the way he had offered his hand in the arena, not with triumph, but with respect, and that same quiet honor followed him now like a shadow that refused to fade. On the fourth day the queen sent her most cunning advisor, a man known for speaking circles around his enemies, his tongue sharper than steel, and his questions shaped like traps. He invited Rain to speak in the hall of questions, where logic and tradition were often tested and exposed like bones. Beneath sand, a chamber was filled with voices that wanted him to fail with words rather than force. They asked him what right he had to accept a queen's hand when his people were not part of their legacy. What future could exist between a human and a world built on stars and stone? What strength did he possess if he refused to rule by dominance and demanded no control over the one he had earned through ritual? Rain answered slowly, not with rehearsed wisdom, but with honest words that seemed too soft for the marble walls. He said he had not come to take or claim, but to see what was possible when two paths crossed without swords between them. He said he did not wish to change their world, but only to be part of it if welcomed, and that respect was not given through fear, but through understanding of difference. The room fell quiet, not in agreement, but in discomfort, for his words had touched something deeper than law, something even that Queen could feel from her private chambers where she listened without being seen. Her fingers curled around the arms of her throne, as if steadying herself against a tide that pulled not from outside, but from within. By the fifth day, the whispers grew into arguments among the nobles, their voices laced with uncertainty. Some saw in Rain a threat to their order, others saw a bridge to a future not shaped by war, and while they debated in shadows, the queen stood at her balcony watching him walk alone through the training grounds, where the wind lifted his coat, and the soldiers paused mid-motion just to see how he would pass them without flinching. Princess approached him that evening, not with pride, but with questions of her own. She asked why he had not humiliated her in the arena when he had the chance, and he told her simply that victory was not about proving someone weak, but about proving oneself strong enough not to destroy. And in that moment, she saw him not as an opponent, but as something she had never known before, a kind of strength her people had never taught. As the sixth day passed, even the halls of power began to tremble, not from battle, but from the quiet pressure of something unexpected, not rebellion, not loyalty, but change like wind before a storm, and still Rain stood untouched at the center of it all, not by force, not by tricks, but by being exactly what no one had planned for. And as the seventh day prepared to dawn, the queen rose from her throne with eyes that no longer held only judgment, but something else, curiosity, perhaps even the seed of choice. And across the palace 1,000 breaths held as the moment approached when she would have to decide, not by code, not by law, but by what she had seen in a human who never asked to rule, but simply came to stand and listen. The morning of the 7th day arrived with a stillness so thick that even the palace winds dared not whisper across the stones. The sun had not yet broken through the crystal canopy, and yet the courtyards were already awake, filled with quiet footsteps and eyes full of questions. Today was the day that Queen would decide, not through tradition, not through threat, but through her own will. For the first time in generations, the final judgment would not be shaped by blood or code, but by something less certain, something born in silence and grown through 7 days of observation. Rain walked through the palace as he had before, without haste or hesitation, his steps light, his thoughts unreadable. Yet even he felt the difference in the air, for the world around him held its breath, not in fear, but in waiting. The garden where he had first asked about the glowing plants now bloomed brighter than before, as if touched by the same uncertainty that ran through the veins of the palace. The servants nodded to him, not with fear, not with ceremony, but with the quiet respect given to someone who had earned their place without demanding it. The queen stood alone in her reflection chamber, where the walls shimmered with the memories of her ancestors, their silent faces carved into the stone behind her, as if waiting to judge her choice. She could feel their presence not as voices, but as pressure, a reminder of the past that had shaped her. Rain with precision and certainty, but now the path forward had no map, only a question and a man who had answered every challenge. Not with force, but with something softer and more dangerous than war. Her thoughts turned not only to him but to her people, to the warriors who now questioned strength, to the nobles who whispered about peace as if it were poison, to the servants who spoke his name not with suspicion but with warmth, and then to her daughter whose defeat had once brought shame, but now stood as the first crack in a wall that had never before been touched. The ceremonial hall had been prepared with care, every stone polished, every banner aligned to tradition, yet nothing could polish the tension that filled the space where the decision would be made. Guests from across the empire gathered in silence, their eyes drawn to the queen as she entered, draped not in armor but in a flowing robe of shadow blue, her crown a symbol not of power but of memory, each jewel a piece of her history, and now perhaps a burden she would leave behind. Rain entered without ceremony, walking beside no one, standing behind no guard. His eyes found the queen's and held them, not with defiance but with a question, the same question that had never left his gaze since the beginning. Not will you surrender, but will you choose? The hall fell into silence as the queen raised her hand and all motion ceased. She looked to the assembled nobles, her voice calm but filled with something they had never heard before. Not command, not cold law, but something deeper, something human. She spoke of change, not as a threat, but as a truth, a force that comes not by permission, but by presence. She spoke of the week just past, of what she had seen, of what her people had seen, and how one man without sword, without title, without blood had stirred the very stones of their world. And yet before she could complete her words, the sound of footsteps shattered the calm. A group of nobles stepped forward, their faces hard, their hands armed with ceremonial blades twisted into symbols of rebellion. Their voices rose not in questions, but in accusation. They called her weak, they called the human a curse. They said the old ways had to be protected, even if it meant silencing a queen who had forgotten her place. Chaos broke through the air like a crack in glass. Guards moved, but hesitation slowed them, for these rebels were not outsiders. They were leaders, generals, mentors. Their betrayal stained the very ground of the chamber, and in the middle of it all, Rain did not run. He stepped between the queen and the traitors, not with a weapon, but with his body standing tall as one of the rebels. Charged without pause, the blade moved fast, aim to end him in a single strike. But Rain moved with the same balance he had shown in the arena, shifting just enough to redirect the force, using the rebel's speed against him. The attacker stumbled, crashing into the floor as gasps echoed around the chamber. Another charged and Rain dodged, then disarmed without striking back, each move controlled, precise, never cruel. Just enough to stop, not enough to destroy then. Before more could attack, a cry rang out across the chamber, one voice sharp and unshaken. The princess stepped forward, sword drawn, eyes blazing, not with vengeance, but with clarity. She placed herself beside Rain, not as a protector, but as a witness. She declared that this man had shown more honor in 7 days than the rebels had in all their years. She said his strength was not just in his hands, but in the way he stood, without hate, without hunger for power, and that she who had lost to him now stood for him. By choice, the chamber froze as the queen rose from her throne, her face unreadable, her hands lifted high as she declared the rebellion broken not by violence, but by the unity that now stood before her, a unity born from defeat, courage, and the will to see beyond blood. She turned to Rain and spoke, not to fulfill a code, but to offer a choice of her own. She offered her hand, not as repayment, not as ritual, but as recognition of something greater than tradition. The choice to build not with fear, but with understanding. The choice to face the unknown, not with weapons, but with open hands. Rain took her hand not with pride, but with respect. And in that simple moment, something changed, not just within the chamber, but across the empire. The people saw a queen who had chosen not because she had to, but because she believed the future might be shaped by courage of a different kind. And as the chamber began to breathe again, as the rebels were led away and the balance restored, the people whispered, not of shame, not of scandal, but of something new, something fragile, something powerful enough to shift stars. The skies above the Zilari capital turned from deep silver to soft blue as the twin suns passed over the edge of the mountains, their glow bathing the palace in a light both strange and warm, as if the very stars had chosen to bless the moment that was unfolding below, within the heart of the ancient palace, where so many had once ruled through strength alone. A new chapter began, not with the clash of swords or the fire of rebellion, but with the quiet aftermath of a storm that had passed without burning the house to the ground. Queen stood now not before a throne, but before her people, the vast balcony beneath her feet, stretching out above the city where thousands had gathered there. Eyes raised, their hearts open to whatever truth she would now speak. Behind her stood Rain, silent and calm. Beside him, the warrior princess, her posture tall, her eyes no longer filled with shame, but with understanding that had taken root across 7 long days. The queen spoke without raised voice, without ceremony. She spoke as a ruler and as a witness to change. Her words were not carved in old language or dipped in law. They flowed like water, honest and unshaken. She told them the story of a challenge answered not by pride, but by duty, of a man who had come alone and offered nothing but himself, of traditions tested not by fire but by presence, of strength redefined by restraint and respect, and of a queen who now stood not as a prisoner of rules, but as a woman who had chosen to meet the future with her own hands. She looked to Rain, and in front of all who watched, she spoke not the words of submission, not the phrases wrapped in ritual, but a question of her own. Would he take her hand, not as payment, not as prize, but as equal, as partner, as someone willing to walk beside, not ahead and not behind, but together? Rain answered without hesitation, not with grand promises, not with speeches, just a nod and a single step forward, taking her hand as if it had always been meant to fit in his. A human hand, rough from war, steady from peace, now joined with the hand of a ruler, carved by duty, shaped by strength, yet open now to something entirely new. The crowd below did not cheer. They stood in quiet awe, not because a queen had chosen to marry, not because a human had become part of their bloodline, but because something had shifted. Something deeper than law, deeper than blood, something real and living and undeniable. Across the city, the mood changed. The guards who once watched Rain with suspicion now saluted, not out of fear, but with quiet recognition. The servants who had once whispered now smiled without needing to speak. The courtiers who had once plotted now paused, as if uncertain whether the game had ended or simply transformed into something more subtle and dangerous. The warrior princess returned to the training grounds, Not in shame, but with a clearer mind she faced her sparring partners, not with the need to win, but with a desire to understand. The strength she had faced in Rain was now something she sought to grow within herself, not as imitation, but as inspiration, and those who trained under her began to notice a difference, not in how she moved, but in how she looked at them, not as tools, not as threats, but as fellow travelers in a galaxy too wide for one way of thinking. The Queen and Rain did not retreat into isolation. They walked the halls together, spoke with citizens, listened to stories, shared meals not at separate tables, but among the people they ruled. They worked together, not just to blend cultures, but to build something new, a path that belonged to neither Earth nor Zalari, but to both, and to all those who might follow. News of the Union spread beyond the Empire, across space stations, through trade routes, into the deep corners of known and unknown. Space ambassadors arrived not just to offer gifts, but to see with their own eyes. The human who had not conquered with force, and the Queen who had not yielded out of weakness, but who had both chosen each other through respect. Whispers grew louder. In places where power had always been rigid, rulers in distant systems began to wonder if perhaps there was more to humans than ambition, more to peace than compromise, if perhaps the most dangerous thing a human could bring was not war, but change. The kind that came with words instead of weapons, the kind that made others question their own truths. And Rain remained the same as he had been on the first day, calm, observant, willing to act, but never seeking control. His strength remained in the silence between his words and the patience behind his eyes, and slowly, even those who still doubted found themselves listening a little longer, thinking a little deeper, waiting to judge until they had truly seen time past. But the memory of that week did not fade. It became a story retold in many forms, and songs and holograms and languages woven from light and sound. Some called it a legend, others a lesson, but most simply called it the day the Queen chose the human, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. And in the deepest halls of the palace, in a room untouched by time, the old codes still remained carved into stone, cold and proud. But beside them, now a new carving began to take shape, not to replace the old, but to stand beside it, a symbol of two hands joined not by blood, not by law, but by choice. The story had reached its end, not with a crown placed on a head, not with a planet bowed in submission, but with a queen and a human standing side by side, not as ruler and subject, not as victor and defeated, but as something else entirely, something rare, something real. And in that union the galaxy learned a quiet truth. Sometimes the most powerful victories leave no scars, only change, and in that change is where the future begins. The end.